The mahogany bench beneath me felt ice cold, despite the stuffy heat of the packed funeral home. My fingers gripped the polished wood so tightly my knuckles had blanched to the color of the lilies adorning Grandpa Edward's casket. I could feel the stares burning into my back, judgmental, questioning, unwelcoming. We were gathered in Meadowbrook Funeral Home, where the man they called the patriarch had planned to be memorialized. Surrounded by people claiming to be his only true family, while I sat alone with my daughter in the last row. Then my cousin Marcus stepped to the podium, straightened his silk tie, and cleared his throat with practiced precision. The room quieted immediately. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. As the eldest grandson and the one Grandpa Edward, trusted most with his legacy, Marcus began, his voice resonating with artificial grief. I want to thank everyone for coming. Family meant everything to him, his real family. His eyes flicked deliberately in my direction, making sure I caught the barb. Which is why Grandpa's estate and final wishes will remain where they belong, with us, the Caldwells. A murmur of approval rippled through the gathering. My heart pounded so violently I thought it might bruise against my ribs. But then I felt movement beside me. My 12-year-old daughter, Zoe, stood up, her copper curls catching the light from the stained glass windows. In her small hands, she clutched a weathered envelope, the edges worn from being carried in her pocket all morning. "Excuse me," she said, her voice clear and steady despite her age. "But I think everyone should hear what Grandpa Edward really wanted." 50 pairs of eyes snapped toward us. Marcus froze mid-gesture. Aunt Patricia gasped audibly from the front. Row. The silence that followed felt heavier than the ornate wooden casket that held my grandfather's remains. I wanted to pull Zoe back down, shield her from what was coming. But something in her determined expression stopped me. This wasn't impulsiveness or childish defiance. This was justice, wrapped in the simple courage only a child could possess. I felt the world suspend around me as I nodded once, giving her permission to continue. Zoe stepped into the center aisle and held up the envelope for everyone to see. "This is Grandpa Edward's real will," she announced. "The one he made me promise to bring today." I hadn't returned to Oak Ridge in 15 years. Driving through the town gates, past the century-old oak trees that gave the community its name, felt like slipping backward through time. Nothing had changed. The same manicured lawns, pristine colonial houses, and judging eyes behind twitching curtains. The air smelled of fresh-cut grass and old money, neither of which had ever felt like they belonged to me. This place stopped being home the moment my mother fled with me in the middle of the night, leaving behind the Caldwell name and fortune for reasons she never fully explained. I was only 10 then, too young to understand the whispers that followed, us out of town, but old enough to feel the sting of rejection. I came back because Edward Caldwell, the grandfather who never acknowledged me after we left, was gone. The same man who'd missed every birthday, ignored every graduation announcement, and returned every letter I'd sent unopened for 15 years, had died at age 84, leaving behind an empire of real estate holdings and a family fractured by secrets. The funeral home was less than a mile from the sprawling Caldwell estate where my mother had grown up and where I'd spent the first decade of my life. I could still remember the way the enormous house creaked at night, how the servants moved like shadows, and how Grandpa Edward would sit in his study smoking cigars, the smell seeping into the wallpaper like his authority seeped into every corner of our lives. When I received news of his death, not from family, but from an obituary a former classmate sent me, I almost didn't come. Why would I drive 6 hours with my daughter to attend the funeral of a man who had erased me from his life? A man who, according to all family records and photographs displayed in the Caldwell home, had only one child, my Uncle Richard, instead of 2. But then the letter arrived. 3 days after I saw the obituary, a courier delivered a sealed envelope to my apartment in Riverdale. The handwriting on the front, shaky but deliberate, addressed it simply to Alexandra. My mother's name, which was also my middle name and what Grandpa Edward had always called me. Inside was a key and a note with 5 words. The truth is in my desk. I recognized the handwriting immediately, though I hadn't seen it since I was a child. It was Grandpa Edward's. The key was old, brass, with an ornate handle, the kind that might open an antique desk or cabinet. The kind of furniture that filled the Caldwell house. I stared at it for hours, turning it over in my hands, wondering what game this was. Was it a cruel joke from one of my cousins? A final manipulation from beyond the grave? Or something else? Entirely? "Mom, what's that?" Zoe had asked, peering over my shoulder, her science homework forgotten on our small kitchen table. I showed her the key, explained whose handwriting was on the note. Her eyes widened with the excitement only a 12-year-old could muster for a mysterious key from a great-grandfather she'd never met. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "We have to go," she declared with absolute certainty. "It's like a treasure hunt." "It's not that simple, sweetie," I tried to explain. "These people, they're not like us. They chose not to have us in their lives." Zoe fixed me with that look she'd inherited from me. Stubborn, determined, impossible to sway once her mind was made up. Maybe they didn't choose. Maybe they didn't know. Maybe that's what the key is for. I'd raised her to believe in fairness, in standing up for what's right. How could I deny her this chance to see justice done, even if I was certain we would only find more disappointment? So we packed the car and drove to Oak Ridge, arriving late the night before the funeral. We stayed at the Pinewood Motel on the edge of town rather than announcing our presence. I wasn't ready for that confrontation, not without knowing what we might find. That morning, we'd arrived at the funeral early. I had a plan. Get in, pay respects, find a way to access Grandpa Edward's study, discover whatever truth he thought was important enough to send me a key after 15 years of silence, and leave before anyone could make a scene. What I hadn't planned for was being spotted immediately by Aunt Patricia, my mother's sister-in-law, whose face had hardened at the sight of me. "Olivia," she'd said, not bothering to lower her voice. "You have some nerve showing up here." "Several." Heads turned. I felt Zoe's hand slip into mine, squeezing reassuringly. "Hello, Aunt Patricia," I replied quietly. "I'm here to pay my respects." "Respects?" She laughed, a brittle sound that reminded me of my mother's description of her. "Beautiful. On the outside, hollow within. You're not welcome here. Your mother made her choice when she abandoned this family and took you with her. Edward never forgave her, and he certainly never acknowledged you after that. I'd expected this, had rehearsed responses during the 6-hour drive. But standing there with my daughter witnessing my humiliation made my prepared words evaporate. "We're staying," I said simply. "He was my grandfather too." Patricia's eyes narrowed. "You stopped being a Caldwell the night your mother stole you away. And whatever you're hoping to gain by coming here, you won't find it. Edward's will is clear. The estate passes to Richard's children. There's nothing for you." She'd stalked away before I could respond, whispering urgently to Marcus and his wife, then to others. Within minutes, the invisible line had been drawn. The Caldwells and their friends clustered on one side of the funeral home, while Zoe and I sat alone on the other, like unwanted strays at a thoroughbred convention. I hadn't planned to fight for recognition or money. I had a modest but comfortable life as a high school English teacher. My small apartment in Riverdale might not have marble countertops or a swimming pool like the Caldwell estate, but it was ours, paid for with honest work rather than inherited privilege. I'd raised Zoe alone after her father decided parenthood, interfered with his career plans, and we'd been fine. More than fine. We'd been happy. But sitting there in that funeral home, watching Marcus perform his role as the grieving grandson, listening to him claim his place as Grandpa Edward's chosen heir, something inside me began to burn, not for the money or the recognition, but for the truth. For whatever Grandpa Edward had deemed important enough to contact me about after all these years. And there was Zoe, watching everything with those perceptive eyes that never missed a detail. I could see the questions forming, the sense of injustice building. She'd been raised on stories of standing up against bullies, of speaking truth to power. How could I show her that sometimes the wiser choice was to stay silent, to walk away with dignity, rather than fight a battle already decided by those with more resources and fewer scruples? "They're lying about him," Zoe whispered to me halfway, through Marcus's speech. "They're making him sound perfect." She was right. The Edward Caldwell being eulogized bore little resemblance to the stern, complicated man I remembered. In their stories, he was generous, warm, loving, a doting patriarch who lived for his family. The grandfather I knew had been demanding, critical, perpetually disappointed in everyone except perhaps Richard, his only son, and the golden child who could do no wrong. "People often only remember the good parts after someone dies," I whispered, back, trying to be diplomatic. Zoe shook her head. "It's more than that. They're pretending we don't exist, like you never mattered to him." Before I could respond, Marcus delivered the line that made my blood freeze. "Grandpa Edward made it clear who his real family was," he said, looking directly at me. "And his estate will remain protected from those who abandoned the Caldwell. Name and values. That's what he wanted. That's what he told me personally many times." The envelope in Zoe's pocket had arrived yesterday morning, delivered to our motel room by an elderly man who identified himself only as an old friend of Edward's. Inside was a document that told a very different story than the one Marcus was currently selling to the assembled mourners. I hadn't had time to fully process its contents, had barely finished reading it before we needed to leave for the funeral. But one thing was clear. If authentic, this document changed everything. Marcus was claiming. Watching my daughter stand before these people, holding up that envelope, I felt a combination of terror and fierce pride. This was not how I'd planned to handle things. I'd intended to be subtle, to avoid confrontation, to search the study quietly, after everyone left. But subtlety had never been Zoe's strong suit. She was her mother's daughter after all. Once convinced of what was right, she was unstoppable. "Young lady," the funeral director stepped forward, clearly uncomfortable with this disruption to his carefully orchestrated service. "Perhaps this could wait until—" "No," Zoe interrupted with a politeness that somehow made her refusal more powerful. "Grandpa Edward wanted everyone to hear this today. He told me so himself." A confused murmur swept through the room. I could see Marcus and Aunt Patricia exchanging alarmed glances. Uncle Richard, my mother's estranged brother, sat straighter in his seat, his expression unreadable. "That's impossible," Marcus scoffed. "You never even met him." Zoe's chin lifted slightly. "Actually, I did. 3 times. He came to see us in Riverdale. The last time was 2 months ago." The revelation hit the room like a thunderclap. I felt dozens of eyes shift from Zoe to me, questions and accusations in their stares. This was news to me, too. My own daughter had kept this secret, apparently at my grandfather's request. "She's making this up," Patricia hissed loudly. "Edward would never." May 12th, Zoe continued steadily. "He brought me a book of poetry, Robert Frost. He said it was my mom's favorite when she was my age." My breath caught. It was true. My mother had read those poems to me countless times, but I'd never told Zoe that detail. "May 23rd, she went on. "He came to my school concert, sat in the back row. Said I played the violin just like Grandma Elaine used to. Another shock. Wave. Grandma Elaine had been a violinist with the State Symphony before she married into the Caldwell family. I'd inherited her violin but had never learned to play. Zoe had found it in our closet years ago and begged for lessons. June 10th, Zoe finished. He knew he was sick, really sick. He gave me this envelope and made me promise to bring it today, if anything happened to him. He said, "When the lies start, make sure they hear the truth." The funeral director looked desperately toward Uncle Richard, clearly seeking guidance on how to handle this situation. But Richard remained motionless, his eyes fixed on Zoe with an intensity that made me nervous. "Let her read it," a voice said suddenly. It was Mrs. Holloway, Grandpa Edward's housekeeper for over 40 years. She stood from her seat in the back corner, her aged frame somehow commanding despite her small stature. If Edward wanted it read, then it should be read. "This is absurd," Marcus protested. "We have the official will. It's been filed with our attorney. This is clearly some kind of—" "Let her read it," Richard finally spoke, his voice cutting through his son's objections like a blade. "I want to hear what my father had to say." The room fell silent again. Marcus sank back into his seat, clearly, shocked by his father's betrayal. Aunt Patricia's mouth opened and closed wordlessly. Zoe looked at me one more time, seeking final permission. I nodded, my heart thundering in my chest. Whatever happened next would change everything, but there was no turning back now. She carefully opened the envelope, removing several handwritten pages. Taking a deep breath, she began to read. "To my family, gathered here today. If you're hearing these words, then I've finally run out of time to make things right in person. I, Edward James Caldwell, being of sound mind but failing body, wish to correct the record of my life and the grievous errors I've made." Zoe's voice, clear and strong, carried through the silent room. I watched the faces of my estranged family. As they listened, emotions shifting from disbelief to shock to something more complicated. 15 years ago, I made the worst mistake of my life. I chose pride over love, appearance over truth, and in doing so, I lost half of my heart when Alexandra took her daughter Olivia and left Oakridge. A soft gasp escaped someone nearby. I felt tears building behind my eyes. He'd called my mother by her name, not Richard's sister, or the troublemaker, as I'd heard him refer to her during my childhood. The story you've all been told, that Alexandra abandoned her family, that she chose to leave, is a lie I allowed to spread because the truth was too painful to acknowledge. The truth is that I forced her to go. The confession hung in the air like smoke. Aunt Patricia's face had gone pale. Marcus stared at the floor. Only Richard seemed unsurprised, his expression grim but resigned. Alexandra discovered financial irregularities in the family business, evidence that would have implicated me in tax fraud and illegal business dealings spanning decades. Rather than face exposure and potential prison, I gave her an ultimatum. Leave Oakridge with her daughter and never return, or I would ensure Richard lost custody of his children in the scandal that would follow. I couldn't breathe. My mother had never told me why we left that night, had only said that Grandpa Edward had made it impossible to stay. When I'd asked over the years, she would change the subject or simply say, "Some bridges can't be unburned." She'd taken the full truth to her grave 5 years ago. Alexandra chose to protect her brother's family at the cost of her own place in this community. She sacrificed her inheritance, her home, and her good name to shield Richard's children from losing their father. And I, to my eternal shame, let you all believe she was the villain in this story. Uncle Richard had his head in his hands now. His shoulders were shaking slightly. Patricia had moved away from him, her expression horrified. In the years that followed, I convinced myself I'd done what was necessary to protect the Caldwell legacy. I told myself Olivia was better off away from our toxic family dynamics. I justified every cruel decision by focusing on the business, on the family name, on appearances. Zoe turned the page, her voice never wavering despite the weight of the words she was delivering. 3 months ago, I received a diagnosis of terminal pancreatic cancer. With death staring me in the face, the illusions I'd built crumbled. I reached out to find Alexandra, only to discover she had passed away 5 years earlier. I had never apologized, never made amends, never told her I was wrong. My tears were flowing freely now. Mom had died never knowing that Grandpa Edward had regretted what he'd done. She'd gone to her grave believing her father had never forgiven her for standing up to him. But I found Olivia, living a modest but dignified life in Riverdale. I observed her from a distance at first, too cowardly to approach. I saw a woman of integrity who had built a life on her own terms. I saw her daughter, Zoe, who has her grandmother's spirit and talent. Eventually, I found the courage to introduce myself to my great-granddaughter, though I asked her not to tell her mother until the time was right. I looked at Zoe, who met my eyes with a mixture of apology and determination. She'd carried this secret for months, honoring a promise to a man she barely knew because she'd sensed how important it was. The official will my attorneys have filed divides my estate between Richard's children, as you've all been told, but that document is incomplete. This letter serves as a legal codicil to that will, properly witnessed and notarized. Marcus stood up abruptly. This is preposterous. A handwritten note can't override a formal will. This is clearly a manipulation. Mr. Caldwell, the funeral director interrupted, pointing to the bottom of the page Zoe held. That appears to be Judge Harmon's notary seal and signature. And that, he squinted, looks like Reverend Mitchell's signature as witness. The elderly reverend, seated near the front, nodded solemnly. I witnessed Edward sign this document 6 weeks ago. He was of sound mind and absolutely certain of his decision. Marcus fell silent, his face flushing with anger or embarrassment, or both. Zoe continued reading. I hereby amend my will as follows. Half of my estate, including the main Caldwell house and an equal share of the business holdings, is to be inherited by my granddaughter, Olivia Caldwell James. The other half remains divided as previously stated among Richard's children. The room erupted in shocked whispers. Patricia clutched her chest dramatically. Marcus looked like he might be sick. Additionally, Zoe read over the growing noise, raising her voice slightly, I leave my personal study and all its contents exclusively to Olivia, including the desk where she and her mother spent so many hours reading together when she was a child. The key should have reached her before this letter was read. My hand went automatically to my pocket, where the brass key still sat, suddenly feeling much heavier. My final request is this, that the Caldwell family right the wrong I committed 15 years ago. Welcome Olivia and Zoe back into the family. They were unfairly taken from. Acknowledge the sacrifice Alexandra made to protect all of you, and most importantly, begin to heal the divisions I created with my pride and fear. Zoe carefully folded the pages and looked up. The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved, no one spoke, as if the entire room was processing a seismic shift in their understanding of the past 15 years. Finally, Uncle Richard stood up. He looked older than his 62 years, grief etched deeply into his face. He walked slowly toward me, and for a moment I thought he might object, might deny everything we'd just heard. Instead, he stopped in front of my seat, his eyes red-rimmed and filled with a sorrow that seemed to reach back decades. I knew, he said, his voice breaking. I knew what he made her do. I knew she left to protect my children, and I never had the courage to stand up to him, to bring you both back home where you belonged. He reached for my hand, and after a moment's hesitation, I let him take it. "I've lived with that shame every day," he continued. "I tried to find you both after he told me he was dying. I hired investigators, but you changed your name after Alexandra." He couldn't finish the sentence. "After Mom died," I completed. "For him. We became the Jameses legally. It was her maiden name." Richard nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "She was the best of us, you know. The only one brave enough to stand up to him. And you're just like her." He turned to face the rest of the family. "Everything we just heard is true. Edward forced Alexandra out to cover up his own crimes. She protected us all, and we repaid her with silence and lies. I won't be part of that anymore." He looked back at me. "I know this doesn't change the past. I know we can't make up for 15 years of absence. But if you're willing, I'd like to try." I didn't know what to say. This was more than I'd ever expected. Vindication, yes, but also an acknowledgement of the truth my mother had carried to her grave. Before I could respond, Marcus pushed forward, his face contorted with anger. "This is ridiculous. We're supposed to just hand over half of everything to someone who hasn't been part of this family for 15 years? Someone who shows up at the funeral with some convenient letter? For all we know, she forged the whole thing." "Marcus," Richard warned, but his son wasn't finished. "No, I won't accept this. I'll contest it in court. This so-called codicil won't hold up, and enough." The voice came from the back of the room, Mrs. Holloway again, stepping forward with something in her hands. Edward anticipated this reaction. That's why he gave me this to hold until today. She approached and handed me a small USB drive. "He recorded a video statement with his attorney last month," she explained. "Everything he wrote in that letter, he also documented legally. He knew some might try to fight his final wishes." Marcus fell silent, the fight visibly draining from him as he realized the battle was already lost. The funeral director cleared his throat awkwardly. "Perhaps we should continue with the service and address these matters afterward." But it was too late for that. The carefully constructed narrative of Edward Caldwell's life and legacy had been shattered, replaced with a messy, painful truth that couldn't be neatly packaged back into a traditional funeral service. People began to move. Some approaching me with uncertain expressions, others gathering in small clusters to whisper urgently. The unified front of the Caldwell family had fractured, revealing the fault lines that had always existed beneath the surface. Zoe returned to my side, slipping her hand into mine. "Are you mad at me?" she whispered. I pulled her into a tight hug. "No, sweetheart. I'm proud of you. So proud." "He wasn't what they said he was," she murmured against my shoulder. "But he wasn't what you thought either. He was sad, Mom. Really sad about everything." I nodded, unable to speak past the lump in my throat. Over Zoe's shoulder, I watched as Aunt Patricia approached cautiously, her earlier hostility replaced with something like shame. "I didn't know," she said simply. "About why Alexandra left. Richard never told me the real reason." I nodded, not quite ready to absolve her of 15 years of coldness with a single conversation. "I'd like to. That is, if you're willing." She struggled to find the words. "I'd like to get to know my niece again, and my grandniece." It was a small olive branch, awkwardly extended but genuine. I didn't need to decide everything in this moment, but I could at least acknowledge the effort. "We'll see," I said quietly. "It's been a long time." Patricia nodded, understanding that rebuilding what was broken would take more than a single conversation in a funeral home. As the crowd began to disperse, many approaching to introduce themselves or reconnect after years of separation, I felt something shift inside me. The weight I'd carried since that night 15 years ago, the questions, the hurt, the sense of rejection, didn't disappear. But it transformed into something I could finally set down. My mother had protected her family at the cost of her own happiness. My grandfather had made a terrible mistake and spent his final days trying to make amends, and my daughter had found the courage to speak truth to power when everyone else was content with comfortable lies. The Caldwell legacy wasn't what any of us had believed. It wasn't the money or the status or the carefully maintained appearances. It was the truth that finally emerged when everything else fell away. As we prepared to leave the funeral home, Zoe asked, "Are we going to stay? In Oak Ridge?" I looked around at the place I'd once called home, at the family I'd been separated from, at the complicated inheritance that awaited me. Not just the material possessions, but the relationships that would need to be rebuilt, or, in some cases, built from scratch. "I don't know yet," I answered honestly, "but we'll figure it out together." She smiled, satisfied with that answer for now. "Can we go see the desk? The one Grandpa Edward left you? The one with the key?" I nodded, curious myself about what secrets that desk might hold, what final message my grandfather might have left for me there. Whatever we found, whatever came next, one thing was certain. The truth had finally been spoken. And in that truth, painful as it was, lay the possibility of healing wounds I'd thought would remain open forever. The key felt heavy in my palm. As we approached the Caldwell estate, a sprawling colonial mansion set back from the road behind wrought iron gates that had once seemed impossibly tall to my child's eyes. Now, as an adult returning after 15 years, the house looked smaller somehow, though no less imposing with its white columns and manicured hedges. "Is this where you grew up?" Zoe whispered beside me, her eyes wide as we pulled into the circular driveway. I nodded, memories washing over me in disorienting waves. Until I was 10. My bedroom was on the second floor, corner window with the maple tree outside. "The one you could climb down?" she asked, referencing a story I'd told her years ago about sneaking out to watch meteor showers with my mother when Grandpa Edward was away on business. "That's the one," I smiled, surprised she remembered. Mrs. Holloway was waiting for us on the front steps, her silver hair pulled back in the same neat bun she'd worn for as long as I could remember. She'd aged, of course. The young woman who used to slip me cookies when Grandpa wasn't looking was now well into her 70s, but her eyes were just as kind. "Welcome home, Miss Olivia," she said, embracing me with unexpected warmth. "And this must be Miss Zoe." She extended her hand formally, which made Zoe stand a little straighter as she shook it. "We've met," Zoe said. "But you probably don't remember. I came with Grandpa Edward last month." Mrs. Holloway's eyes crinkled with a smile. "Of course I remember. You ate 3 slices of lemon cake and told me all about your science project on bioluminescent algae." Zoe beamed at being remembered so specifically. "Your Uncle Richard called," Mrs. Holloway continued, guiding us into the foyer. "He said you'd be coming by to see the study. The family is gathering at his house for the post-funeral reception, so you'll have privacy here for a while." I felt a rush of gratitude for this. Small consideration. I wasn't ready to face the entire Caldwell clan again so soon, especially not in a social setting where tensions would be barely concealed beneath polite conversation. The interior of the house was exactly as I remembered. Marble floors in the B entrance hall, a sweeping staircase with ornate banisters, oil paintings of stern-faced Caldwell ancestors lining the walls. The grandfather clock in the corner still chimed the quarter hour with the same melodic sequence that had been the soundtrack of my childhood. "Nothing's changed," I murmured, trailing my fingers along the polished oak of the entryway table. "Mr. Edward didn't care much for redecorating," Mrs. Holloway replied. "Said it was a waste of good furniture to replace things that weren't broken." She led us down the main hallway toward the west wing of the house, where Grandpa Edward's private study had always been strictly off-limits to children, and most adults, during my childhood. The double doors of dark mahogany still looked formidable, designed to intimidate visitors and emphasize the importance of whatever happened behind them. Mrs. Holloway produced a key ring from her pocket and unlocked the doors, then stepped aside. "I'll leave you to it," she said gently. "Take all the time you need. There's fresh lemonade in the kitchen when you're finished." With that, she retreated down the hallway, her sensible shoes making soft tapping sounds against the hardwood. Floors. I stood frozen before the open doorway, suddenly hesitant. What would I find inside? What final message had my grandfather been so determined to deliver that he'd orchestrated this elaborate scenario from beyond the grave? "Mom?" Zoe touched my arm, concern in her eyes. "Are you okay?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, just remembering." The study beyond the doors was a time capsule. Leather-bound books lining built-in shelves, a massive globe in a wooden stand by the window, heavy velvet curtains filtering the afternoon sunlight into a warm, amber glow. The smell of leather, paper, and the faint trace of cigar smoke hung in the air, though Grandpa Edward had supposedly given up smoking a decade ago, according to his letter. And there, commanding the center of the room, stood his desk. A magnificent piece of craftsmanship, hand-carved walnut with intricate details along the edges and brass handles on the drawers. It had been imported from England in the 1880s, part of the original Caldwell patriarch's collection, and had passed down through generations to symbolize the authority of whoever sat behind it. I approached it slowly, running my fingers along its smooth surface. This was where Grandpa Edward had built his empire, made decisions that affected dozens of businesses and hundreds of employees, and apparently, where he'd orchestrated the exile of his own daughter and granddaughter to protect himself from legal consequences. "Is this the desk he meant?" Zoe asked, circling it curiously. "The one you used to read at?" The memory surfaced unexpectedly, sitting on my mother's lap in this very room, the two of us huddled in the oversized leather chair on Sunday afternoons when Grandpa Edward was at his club. We'd read poetry and adventure stories, careful to leave everything exactly as we'd found it before he returned. It had been our secret rebellion, using his sanctum for something as frivolous as children's literature. "Yes," I said softly. "This is it." I withdrew the brass key from my pocket and examined it more closely. It was ornate and old-fashioned, definitely not for any of the desk's standard drawers, which had more modern locks. "There," Zoe pointed to a small keyhole nearly hidden in the carved molding along the right side of the desk. "That looks like it would fit." She was right. The keyhole was cleverly disguised within the decorative pattern, invisible unless you were specifically looking for it. I inserted the key with trembling fingers and turned it. A soft click was followed by the sound of a spring releasing, and a small panel in the side of the desk slid open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound journal and a small wooden box. I removed them carefully, placing them on the desk's surface. "What are they?" Zoe asked, leaning close. "I'm not sure," I admitted, running my hand over the journal's worn cover. It was high-quality leather, soft with age and use, with no title or identification on the outside. I opened it to the first page and gasped softly. In my mother's distinctive handwriting was a single line. "The truth, as I discovered it. Alexandra Caldwell, March 1995. My mother's journal, from the year before we fled Oak Ridge. I flipped through the pages quickly, seeing dates, notes, figures, what looked like a detailed record of financial transactions and irregularities in the Caldwell business operations. Exactly what Grandpa Edward had mentioned in his letter at the funeral. "It's evidence," I whispered. "Mom was building a case." The journal documented everything: offshore accounts, falsified records, tax evasion schemes, questionable business practices spanning decades. My mother, who had worked as the company's accountant before I was born, had meticulously tracked every discrepancy she discovered. The final entry was dated the night before we left Oak Ridge. "He gave me no choice. Richard's children or mine. I choose Olivia's freedom over Richard's comfort. Maybe someday he'll understand why we had to go. Tears blurred my vision. Here was confirmation of everything the letter had claimed. My mother hadn't abandoned her family on a whim or out of selfishness. She'd been forced into an impossible choice and had sacrificed her own happiness to protect others. With unsteady hands, I opened the wooden box next. Inside, nestled on a bed of velvet, was a strand of pearls I recognized immediately. My grandmother Elaine's signature necklace, the one she wore in every formal portrait that hung in the Caldwell house. Beneath it was a folded note in Grandpa Edward's handwriting. Alexandra should have inherited these. Now they belong to Olivia. Some heirlooms should follow the heart, not just the name. A small sound escaped me, something between a laugh and a sob. How strange that these pearls, which had seemed so unremarkable in childhood portraits, could now feel so significant. They represented acknowledgement, apology, connection to a heritage I'd been denied for 15 years. Mom? Zoe's voice pulled me back to the present. She was examining the desk more closely, her fingers tracing patterns in the wood. I think there's something else here. She was right. The hidden compartment had a false bottom. When I removed it, I found a sealed envelope addressed simply to Olivia and a small USB drive, similar to the one Mrs. Holloway had given me at the funeral. My hand shook as I opened the envelope. Unlike the formal letter Zoe had read at the funeral, this note was personal, the handwriting less steady, more vulnerable. Olivia, by now you've heard my public confession and apology. This is the private one. I was wrong. About everything that mattered. I allowed fear and pride to cost me my daughter and granddaughter. No business, no reputation, no amount of money was worth that loss. Your mother was the conscience of this family, the only one brave enough to confront me with what I'd become. I silenced her rather than listen, and I've regretted it every day since. The journal contains evidence of everything I did. The USB drive contains my full confession, recorded with my attorney. What you do with this information is entirely your choice. Use it to clear your mother's name. Use it as leverage if the family resists your rightful place among us. Or destroy it all and start fresh. The choice is yours, as it should have been your mother's. Know this. In my final months, watching you from afar, meeting Zoe in secret, I found more peace than in all the years of empty success that came before. You built a life of integrity without the Caldwell fortune. You raised a remarkable daughter on your own. You succeeded in all the ways that truly matter. I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I hope in time you might find room for the truth in your heart. And perhaps, through Zoe, some small piece of this broken family might be restored. With regret, love, and hope, Grandpa Edward. I read the letter twice, then handed it silently to Zoe. She read it carefully, her young face solemn, with the weight of adult complications. He really loved you, she said finally, even if he didn't know how to show it until it was too late. From the mouth of a 12-year-old, the observation cut straight to my heart. Maybe that was true. Maybe love and fear had been tangled, together in my grandfather's heart all along, each one disguising itself as the other, until he couldn't tell them apart anymore. I looked around the study with new eyes, seeing beyond the symbols of power and authority to the man who had sat, here alone night after night, building walls of wealth and influence while his family splintered around him. How lonely that must have been, even if self-inflicted. Why didn't you tell me you were meeting him? I asked Zoe gently, not accusatory, but genuinely curious. She shrugged, suddenly looking her age again. He asked me not to. Said he needed to fix some things before you saw him. He was afraid you wouldn't let him explain. He was probably right, I admitted. He was really sick, Mom. I could tell. But he always asked about you first. What you were teaching, if you were happy, what books you were reading. He kept a list of everything I told him about you in a little notebook. The image of my formidable grandfather, secretively writing down details about my ordinary life, was almost too much to bear. What a waste of years. What an unnecessary tragedy for everyone involved. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Holloway stood there, her expression apologetic. "I'm sorry to disturb you, but the family is returning soon for the reading of the will. Mr. Richard thought you might want to know." I nodded, gathering the journal, the pearls, and the letters. "Thank you. We'll be out in a moment." When she'd gone, I looked at Zoe. "What do you think we should do?" She considered this seriously, her forehead creasing in that way that made her look so much like my mother. "I think we should stay," she said finally. "Not forever, maybe, but long enough to know if they're worth knowing." Out of the mouths of babes. She was right, of course. Running away now would only continue the cycle that had begun 15 years ago. Staying, facing the complicated tangle of relationships in history, was the harder choice, but possibly the healing one. "We have a life back in Riverdale," I reminded her. "Your school, my job, our friends." "Summer vacation starts next." "Week," she countered. "We could stay until August, see how it goes. You can write anywhere, right? That's what you always say." My freelance writing career was flexible. It was true. And the thought of simply walking away from this unexpected inheritance, not just the material wealth, but the truth, the connections, the chance to reclaim a part of my history, felt wrong somehow. "All right," I said. "We'll stay for the summer. See what happens." Zoe's face lit up with a smile. "Can I have the bedroom with the maple tree?" I laughed, despite everything. "We'll see. First, we have to get through the official reading of the will. Are you ready for that?" Her expression turned serious again. "I'm ready if you are." We closed up the study, locking the secret compartment and the main doors behind us. As we walked through the silent house toward the kitchen where Mrs. Holloway waited, I felt a strange sense of both closure and beginning. The past had been unlocked, its secrets finally revealed. Now came the harder part, figuring out what to build in its place. The formal reading of the will took place in the library, another room I remembered vividly from childhood. Floor to ceiling, bookshelves, leather armchairs arranged around a massive fireplace, windows overlooking the rose garden my grandmother had designed decades ago. It was where the family had always gathered for important announcements and decisions, maintaining a tradition that stretched back generations. Mr. Harrington, the family attorney who'd served the Caldwells since before I was born, looked startled to see me enter the room with Zoe. His eyes darted to Richard, who nodded almost imperceptibly. The old lawyer cleared his throat, adjusted his glasses, and regained his professional composure. "Now that everyone is present, we can begin," he announced, setting his briefcase on the central table. The atmosphere was tense. Marcus sat rigidly beside his wife, deliberately avoiding eye contact with me. His sisters, Elaine and Catherine, looked uncomfortable but less openly hostile. Patricia sat close to Richard, her expression carefully neutral. Several cousins and their spouses filled the remaining seats, all watching me with varying degrees of curiosity and wariness. "Before I read the formal will," Mr. Harrington began, "I must acknowledge that there has been a significant amendment in the form of a codicil, properly executed and witnessed according to state law. This codicil substantially alters the distribution of assets as originally documented." Marcus made a small noise of protest, but fell silent when Richard placed a warning hand on his arm. Mr. Harrington proceeded to read the official documents, confirming everything we'd already heard at the funeral. Half of the Caldwell estate, including the main house, various properties and business holdings, would pass to me. The other half would be divided among Richard's 3 children. Additionally, certain personal items and the contents of the study were designated specifically for me. When he finished, the silence in the room was profound. Finally, Richard spoke. "I believe my father's wishes are clear and just." He looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each family member. In turn, "We will honor them without contest." Marcus stood abruptly. "This is—" "Enough, Marcus," Richard cut him off sharply. "Your grandfather made his decision. His reasons are explained in the letter and video statement. Would you like Mr. Harrington to play that for everyone here? To have every detail of what happened 15 years ago laid bare in this room?" Marcus paled slightly. "No, but—" "Then accept his decision with dignity," Richard finished firmly. "Half of a substantial fortune is still more than most people see in a lifetime. Your inheritance remains significant." The room fell silent again. I felt dozens of eyes on me, evaluating, judging, wondering. Would I sell my share of the business? Move into the main house? Use the journal's evidence to pursue legal action against the family? "I don't expect anyone to welcome me with open arms," I said, breaking the silence. 15 years is a long time, and I'm essentially a stranger to most of you now. I don't plan to upend anyone's life or business overnight. Relief visibly washed over several faces. "But I do intend to understand what I've inherited," I continued. "Not just the properties and accounts, but the history, good and bad. My mother deserved better than she received from this family. I want to make sure her name is cleared." Richard nodded solemnly. "It will be. I promise you that." "And Zoe." "And I will be staying through the summer," I added. "We have a lot to learn about being Caldwells again, or figuring out if that's even what we want." Elaine, the middle of Richard's children, spoke up unexpectedly. "I have a daughter Zoe's age, Emma. They might get along. She's always wanted more cousins her age." It was a small gesture, but significant. The first tentative bridge extended from the next generation. I smiled gratefully at her. "I'd like that. Thank you." As the meeting concluded and people began to disperse, Richard approached me privately. "Will you stay here, in the main house?" he asked. "It's yours now, after all." I shook my head. "Not yet. That's too much too soon. Is there somewhere smaller on the property? Somewhere we could have some privacy while we figure things out?" "The caretaker's cottage by the pond," he suggested. "It's fully modernized, comfortable but not overwhelming. Close enough to be convenient, far enough for independence." "That sounds perfect," I agreed. He hesitated, then added, "I missed you, Olivia. Every day for 15 years, I should have fought harder to find you, to bring you home." "Mom made her choice to protect your children," I reminded him gently. "She wouldn't have wanted you to undo that sacrifice." "She always was the better one of us," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I'm sorry I couldn't be as brave as she was." As Richard walked away, Zoe appeared at my side. "Uncle Richard seems nice," she observed. "Sad but nice." "Yes," I agreed. "I think he is." We made our way out to the garden, needing fresh air and space to process everything that had happened. The rose garden was in full bloom, filling the air with sweet fragrance. I remembered my grandmother tending these bushes, teaching me the names of each variety, showing me how to deadhead the spent blossoms to encourage new growth. "Do you think we belong here?" Zoe asked suddenly, looking around at the grand estate. That was now, improbably, half mine. It was the question I'd been asking myself since the moment Grandpa Edward's letter was read at the funeral. Did we belong in this world of privilege and complicated family history? Could we find a place here without losing who we'd become during our years away? "I think belonging isn't something you find," I said slowly. "It's something you create. We get to decide what parts of this legacy we want to embrace and what parts we need to change." Zoe considered this, then nodded. "Like Grandpa Edward. He did bad things, but then he tried to fix them at the end." Exactly, I said. People are complicated. Families even more so. A breeze rustled through the garden, carrying the scent of roses and the distant sound of chimes from the old clock tower in town. This place had shaped me, for better and worse. Now, improbably, I had the chance to reshape it in return. I think we should plant wildflowers, Zoe declared, looking at an empty corner of the garden. Mix them in with all these fancy roses. Make it less perfect, but more interesting. I smiled, seeing the metaphor clearly. I think that's an excellent idea. As the sun began to set over the Caldwell estate, casting long shadows across the manicured lawns, I felt something settle within me. Not closure exactly, but a willingness to begin again. To plant new seeds in old soil and see what might grow from the truth finally brought to light. The caretaker's cottage turned out to be a charming two-bedroom structure nestled among weeping willows at the edge of the property's small lake. Its stone exterior and thatched roof made it look like something from a fairy tale, though the interior had been thoroughly modernized with a sleek kitchen, comfortable furnishings, and high-speed internet that Zoe immediately tested by video, calling her best friend back in Riverdale. "You won't believe where we're staying," she gushed, spinning her laptop in a circle to show off our temporary home. "There's a lake right outside, and I'm going to meet my cousins tomorrow." I smiled at her enthusiasm while unpacking our hastily assembled suitcases. We'd driven back to Riverdale yesterday to collect enough clothes and essentials for an extended stay, notified my principal that I'd be taking personal leave for the remainder of the school year, thankfully only 2 weeks, and put our small apartment on a sublease for the summer. It had been a whirlwind of activity, leaving little time for me to process the seismic shift in our circumstances. Now, as twilight settled over the Caldwell estate, reality was finally catching up to me. I stepped onto the cottage's small deck overlooking the water, watching dragonflies skim across the surface as frogs began their evening chorus. How strange that this peaceful spot had been here all along, just a few hundred yards from the house, where I grew up, yet I'd rarely visited it as a child. Grandpa Edward had kept the family tightly clustered around the main house, discouraging exploration of the property's more remote corners. A soft knock at the door interrupted my thoughts. Mrs. Holloway stood there with a covered basket. "I thought you might appreciate some dinner," she said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. "I imagine you haven't had time to stock the kitchen." "That's incredibly thoughtful," I said, genuinely touched. "Thank you." She bustled into the kitchen, unpacking containers of homemade chicken pot pie, fresh bread, and a mason jar of peach cobbler. "It's good to have you back, Miss Olivia. This place has needed some fresh air for a long time." As she worked, I noticed how at home she seemed in the cottage. "Did you spend time here before?" I asked. A wistful smile crossed her face. "I lived here for nearly 20 years, until Mr. Edward decided I should move into the main house after your grandmother passed, said he needed the help closer at hand." This was news to me. "I didn't realize this was your home." "Oh, it's not mine," she corrected quickly. "Always belonged to the Caldwells. But yes, I raised my son here while I worked for your grandparents." She glanced around with obvious affection. "It's a good place to begin again." The phrase struck me as oddly fitting. "Your son, is he still in Oak Ridge?" Her expression clouded slightly. "No, Thomas left many years ago. Works as an architect in Seattle now. Comes back for Christmas most years." She changed the subject abruptly. "Miss Elaine called to say she'll bring Emma by tomorrow around 10 if that suits. She thought the girls might enjoy exploring the grounds together." "That sounds perfect," I agreed, making a mental note to ask about her son another time. There seemed to be a story there. After Mrs. Holloway left, Zoe and I enjoyed the simple but delicious meal on the deck, listening to the evening sounds of the estate coming alive. Cicadas, frogs, the occasional splash of a fish jumping in the lake. It felt surreal to be here, surrounded by Caldwell property that was now partially mine, trying to reconcile the painful past with this unexpected present. "I like it here," Zoe declared, scraping the last of the cobbler from her bowl. "It feels like we're in our own story." I smiled at her perspective. "I suppose we are, in a way. Every family has its own ongoing story. And we get to change how this one goes," she added with 12-year-old certainty. "That's what Grandpa Edward wanted, right? For us to make things better?" Her insight sometimes took my breath away. Yes, I think that's exactly what he wanted. Later, after Zoe had fallen asleep in her new bedroom, already claiming it with her collection of science posters and the violin case propped carefully in the corner, I sat at the small desk by the window and opened my mother's journal again. In the quiet of the cottage, I allowed myself to fully absorb what she had documented, not just the financial improprieties, but her increasing moral distress as she discovered how deep the corruption went. One entry particularly caught my attention. "Edward isn't solely responsible. The entire board knows, or suspects, they've built their wealth on this system for decades. Confronting just one man won't change the pattern." The revelation stopped me cold. This wasn't just about Grandpa Edward's individual actions. It was about a culture of corruption that had been normalized within the Caldwell business empire. A system that my mother had tried to challenge, only to be silenced and exiled. And now I owned half of it. The weight of that responsibility settled over me like a heavy cloak. What was I supposed to do with this knowledge? Expose everything and potentially destroy the company that employed hundreds of people? Ignore it and become complicit myself? Neither option seemed right. I closed the journal and gazed out at the moonlight reflecting on the lake's surface. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, meeting Elaine's daughter, beginning to understand the business I'd inherited, finding my place in this complicated family once again. But tonight, I needed to sit with the truth my mother had discovered and honor her courage in documenting it, even when it cost her everything. Sleep came fitfully, filled with dreams of my mother standing in Grandpa Edward's study, both of them, younger than I remembered, locked in an argument I couldn't quite hear. In the dream, I tried to reach them, to stand between them, but my feet wouldn't move. I woke at dawn with tears on my cheeks and a renewed determination to make things right, not just for my mother's memory, but for the future Zoe would inherit. The morning brought sunshine and the promised visit from cousin Elaine and her daughter Emma. Elaine was the middle child of Uncle Richard's three, less openly hostile than Marcus, but also less warm than Catherine, the youngest. I remembered her as a serious teenager who'd mostly ignored me as a child, too busy with her own friends and activities to bother with a younger cousin. The woman who arrived at our cottage door was a surprise, casually dressed in jeans and a light sweater, hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, nothing like the polished Caldwell image I'd expected. Her daughter Emma was Zoe's height, but with a willowy build that contrasted with my daughter's more athletic frame. She had her mother's serious eyes, but a shy smile that immediately put me at ease. "Thanks for letting us come by," Elaine said, accepting the coffee I offered. "Emma's been bursting with questions since the funeral. I thought it would be good for the girls to get acquainted." The girls needed no encouragement. Within minutes, they had discovered a mutual interest in astronomy and were deep in conversation about the upcoming meteor shower, completely ignoring the adults. "She seems wonderful," Elaine commented, watching Zoe gesture enthusiastically as she explained something to Emma. "Very confident for her age." "She's had to be," I replied. "It's been just the two of us since she was 7. Elaine nodded, looking thoughtful. "I've been thinking about what your mother did, protecting us by leaving. I'm not sure I would have had that kind of courage." The admission surprised me. I didn't know about any of it until Grandpa Edward's letter was read at the funeral. Mom never told me why we left. "She wouldn't have," Elaine agreed. "Alexandra was always protective of family, even when we didn't deserve it. She hesitated, then continued more softly. I remember the night you both disappeared. Dad was frantic, but Grandpa Edward was so calm. He told us you'd gone to visit relatives and might not be back for a while. I was 15, old enough to know something was wrong, but not brave enough to ask questions. Her honesty was unexpected and oddly touching. It wasn't your responsibility to fix what the adults broke, I assured her. Maybe not then, she acknowledged. But it is now. That's partly why I wanted to come today. To tell you that not everyone in the family agrees with Marcus's position. Some of us want to make this right, whatever that looks like. Before I could respond, the girls interrupted with a proposal. Can we take the rowboat out on the lake? Zoe asked, eyes bright with excitement. Emma says there's an island in the middle with a gazebo. The simple request, so normal, so childlike, broke the tension of our adult conversation. If it's okay with your mother, I deferred to Elaine. It's perfectly safe, she assured me. The lake is only about 8 feet at its deepest point, and both girls can swim, right? With life jackets and strict instructions to stay within sight of the cottage, the girls set off in the small wooden rowboat that had been tied at the dock. Their laughter carried across the water as Emma taught Zoe how to navigate, their initial shyness already dissolving into the easy camaraderie of new friendship. She's good with her, I observed as Elaine and I watched from the deck. Patient. Emma doesn't make friends easily, Elaine admitted. She's always been the serious one, more comfortable with books than people, rather like I was. She smiled ruefully. The Caldwell curse. We tend to hold ourselves apart. Not all of you, I countered, thinking of Catherine, who had already texted me twice with offers of help getting settled, and Uncle Richard, who had stopped by last evening just to make sure we had everything we needed. No, not all of us, she agreed, and maybe not anymore. We fell into an easier conversation then, catching up on 15 years of life events. Elaine had become an environmental lawyer, working primarily with conservation groups, about as far from the traditional Caldwell business interests as possible. She'd married an ornithologist who spent half the year doing field research, giving her and Emma a life that alternated between periods of independence and intense family time. It sounded unconventional, but fulfilling. What about you? She asked eventually. Teaching high school English isn't what anyone would have predicted for a Caldwell heir. I laughed at the characterization. I was hardly being groomed as an heir when we left. Besides, I love teaching, helping teenagers find their voice through literature. There's nothing more rewarding. Will you keep teaching, now that you have? She gestured vaguely, encompassing the estate and all it represented. It was the question I'd been asking myself since the funeral. I don't know, I admitted. I need to understand what I've inherited first. Not just the assets, but the responsibilities that come with them. Mom's journal makes it clear there are serious issues with how the business has operated. Elaine's expression grew more serious. The journal Grandpa Edward left you? What exactly did it reveal? I hesitated, unsure how much to share with someone I was just getting to know. Again. But if we were going to rebuild trust, I had to start somewhere. Systematic tax evasion, offshore accounts, possibly some more serious violations regarding environmental regulations and worker safety, I summarized. Mom was building a case, documenting everything. That's what Grandpa Edward was afraid she'd expose. Elaine's face paled slightly. Have you shared this with anyone else? Not yet. I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it. She nodded, looking relieved. Before you do anything, you should talk to Catherine. She's been working as the company's general counsel for the past 5 years. She's been trying to clean things up quietly, but it's been an uphill battle. Your mother's evidence might help her case. This was unexpected news. Catherine's been trying to reform the company from within? She and Dad both, after Grandpa Edward stepped back from Day-to-day operations about 7 years ago. Dad took over as CEO. He's been slowly implementing changes, but Marcus and some of the old guard on the board have resisted at every turn. They're too comfortable with the old ways of doing business. The revelation shifted my understanding of the family dynamics. Perhaps the lines between allies and adversaries weren't as clear as I'd imagined. I'd like to talk to Catherine, I decided, and Uncle Richard. If they're already working toward legitimate business practices, maybe we can join forces. Elaine's smile was genuine. I was hoping you'd say that. Family meeting tomorrow at Catherine's house? Just the 4 of us. You, me, Kath, and Dad. No Marcus, no lawyers, just straight talk about where we go from here. The offer felt right. A chance to build new alliances within the family based on shared values rather than just shared DNA. I'll be there. Our conversation was interrupted by excited shouts from the lake. The girls had reached the small island and were exploring the gazebo, waving enthusiastically from its weathered steps. I used to hide out there as a teenager, Elaine confessed. It was the one place on the property where I felt like I could breathe, away from Grandpa Edward's constant expectations. I understood that feeling perfectly. We all need our islands of escape. Some more literal than others, she agreed with a laugh. As we watched the girls making their way back to the rowboat, animated in conversation despite having just met, I felt a spark of hope ignite. Perhaps the next generation of Caldwells could build something different. Connections based on genuine affection rather than obligation or appearance. Perhaps Zoe and Emma could enjoy the kind of cousin relationship that family wealth and power had denied to our generation. After Elaine and Emma departed with promises to meet again soon, Zoe bubbled, with excitement about her new friend. Emma knows everything about the constellations, she marveled, and she invited me to go stargazing on the hill behind the main house tomorrow night. Can I go? Please? Her enthusiasm was infectious. Of course. I'm meeting with Emma's mom and some other family members tomorrow anyway. It's perfect timing. She showed me a secret panel in the gazebo, Zoe continued. There's a little compartment under one of the benches where her mom and her aunt used to leave notes for each other. Emma said we could use it too, for our own. Secret messages. The idea of the girls creating their own traditions warmed my heart. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. I told her about what happened at the funeral, Zoe added more soberly. About reading Grandpa Edward's letter. She said her dad, Cousin Marcus, was really angry about it, but her mom told him he was being stubborn and unfair. This glimpse into the family dynamics from a child's perspective was revealing. Families often disagree, I said carefully, especially when big changes happen. Emma said her dad isn't bad, just scared of changes, Zoe offered. She thinks he'll come around eventually. That's a very mature perspective. Zoe shrugged. Emma's pretty smart. She says things have been tense in their house for a long time, even before Grandpa Edward died. Something about the business and how it's run. I marveled at how quickly the girls had established enough trust to share family confidences. Children often built bridges between adults without even realizing they were doing so. That evening, as Zoe practiced her violin on the cottage deck, the haunting melody carrying across the still water, I received a text from Uncle Richard asking if I'd have time to visit the company headquarters the following morning before our family meeting. There are some things you should see firsthand, he wrote. As an equal owner, you deserve to understand what you've inherited, both the good and the problematic. I agreed, both nervous and determined to face whatever complicated legacy awaited. Me there. The Caldwell group had always been a shadowy presence in my childhood, the source of our family's wealth and status, but not something children were encouraged to ask questions about. Now I would need to understand it thoroughly if I was going to help shape its future. As darkness fell over the lake, I sat on the cottage steps, watching fireflies emerge along the shoreline, their gentle blinking creating patterns of light against the deepening blue. Zoe joined me, resting her head against my shoulder. "Do you think Grandma would be happy we came back?" she asked softly. The question caught me by surprise. Zoe had been 7 when my mother died, old enough to have clear memories, but young enough that those memories were more impressions than detailed recollections. "I think she'd be proud of how brave you've been," I answered truthfully. "Standing up and reading that letter at the funeral took real courage. That's something she always valued." "But would she want us to stay? To be part of the Caldwells? Again?" I considered this carefully. My mother had never spoken bitterly about the family she'd left behind, despite the painful circumstances. She'd always emphasized that the breach had been with Grandpa Edward specifically, not with the concept of family itself. "I think she'd want us to find the truth and do what's right with it," I said finally. "That's what she tried to do, even when it was difficult. And I think she'd be especially happy to see you finding connections with your cousins." Zoe nodded, satisfied with this answer. "I'm glad we came, Mom, even though it's complicated." "The most worthwhile things usually are," I told her, pulling her close as the first stars appeared overhead. That night, I dreamed of my mother again, but differently this time. We were sitting together in the gazebo on the island, the sun setting, over the lake, and she was smiling. The relaxed, genuine smile I remembered from our life after Oak Ridge, not the tense, guarded expression I now realized she'd worn during our time with the Caldwells. "You're doing fine, Olivia," she said in the dream. "Better than fine. You're doing what I couldn't." I woke with the echo of her words still in my mind, feeling more centered than I had since Grandpa Edward's letter arrived. Whatever challenges awaited at the Caldwell Group headquarters and the family meeting that would follow, I would face them with the same courage my mother had shown, not for revenge or validation, but for truth and the chance to build something better from the ashes of the past. As the dawn light filtered through the cottage windows, I found myself thinking of Zoe's words about the gazebo's secret compartment, a place where sisters once left messages for each other, now being reclaimed by a new generation of cousins. Perhaps that was the model for what we needed to do with the Caldwell legacy itself. Find the hidden spaces of potential, preserve what was worth keeping, and transform the rest into something that could serve the future rather than being imprisoned by the past. The morning held the promise of difficulty, but also possibility. I was ready for both. The Caldwell Group headquarters occupied a 12-story glass and steel building in downtown Oak Ridge, its sleek modern architecture standing in stark contrast to the colonial-style storefronts that lined the rest of Main Street. The company logo, a stylized oak tree with deep roots, was emblazoned across the facade, a constant reminder of the family's historic connection to the town they had essentially built. I'd never visited the building as a child. Grandpa Edward had kept his work and family lives meticulously separated, rarely bringing relatives to the office. Now, as I pulled into the underground parking garage in my modest sedan, looking conspicuously out of place among the luxury vehicles, I felt like an imposter despite technically owning half the company inside. Uncle Richard was waiting in the lobby, dressed in a charcoal suit that managed to look both expensive and understated. His silver hair and confident posture commanded attention from everyone we passed. Employees nodded respectfully as we crossed the marble-floored atrium toward the executive elevator. "I've cleared my morning schedule," he informed me as the doors closed. "No interruptions, no meetings, just you and me discussing what you need to know." His directness was refreshing after years of family secrets. "I appreciate that. Where do we start?" "At the beginning," he said simply as the elevator ascended to the top floor. "With what Alexandra discovered and what Edward did to silence her." Richard's corner office offered panoramic views of Oak Ridge and the surrounding mountains, but it was the wall of family photos that caught my attention. Among the expected portraits of his children and grandchildren was a picture I hadn't seen in years. My mother and Richard as teenagers, arms slung around each other's shoulders, laughing by the lake on the family estate. She looked so young, so unburdened. "I keep it to remind myself what we lost," Richard said, following my gaze. "What I failed to protect." The admission surprised me. This vulnerability was a side of Uncle Richard I'd never seen as a child, when he'd always seemed to embody the Caldwell ideal of reserved strength. "Mom never blamed you," I said quietly. "She understood you had your own children to think about." "That made it worse, not better," he replied, gesturing for me to take a seat at a small conference table near the windows. "She sacrificed everything to protect my family, and I repaid. Her with 15 years of silence. Rather than let the conversation sink into regret, I redirected it. Tell me what she found. I've read her journal, but I want to hear your perspective." Richard nodded, seeming to appreciate my directness. Alexandra was always the one with the eye. The moral compass. Even as children, she was the one who stood up when something wasn't right. When she joined the company's finance department after college, Father saw it as keeping things in the family. What he didn't anticipate was that she would actually scrutinize the books. He activated a screen on the wall, displaying a complex organizational chart of the Caldwell Group's various holdings and subsidiaries. What looks like one company is actually dozens, strategically incorporated across multiple jurisdictions, he explained. Some legitimate, some less so. Alexandra started noticing discrepancies, profits that disappeared from one subsidiary only to reappear inflated in another, assets that were mysteriously undervalued for tax purposes, then leveraged at their real value for loans. "Tax evasion," I summarized. "That was just the beginning," Richard continued grimly. "She dug deeper and found environmental violations that had been systematically covered up. Workplace safety incidents that were buried with settlements and NDAs. Even instances of bribing local officials to look the other way on zoning and permitting issues. The scale of corruption was staggering. And Grandpa Edward was behind all of it." Richard's expression was complicated, part anger, part sadness. He inherited some of these practices from his father, then expanded them. By the time Alexandra started raising concerns, they were deeply embedded in how the company operated. She wanted to clean house completely. He saw it as a threat to everything he'd built. So he forced her out, I concluded, the pieces falling into place. "She came to me first," Richard admitted, his voice tight with old pain. "Showed me what she'd found, asked for my support in confronting Father. I hesitated, suggested a more gradual approach. She said some things can't be fixed slowly, that sometimes you need to break the system to rebuild it properly." The words sounded so like my mother that my chest ached. What happened next? Father discovered they'd been meeting. He assumed I was conspiring with her, threatened to remove me as his successor. I had 3 young children, a new mortgage on the house Marcus now lives in. I panicked, told him I'd had no idea what Alexandra was planning. Richard's face reflected decades old. Shame. I betrayed her to save myself. The confession hung in the air between us. I could have responded with anger or judgment, but what would that accomplish now? "You've been trying to fix it since," I observed instead, gesturing to the company. "Shortcut," making changes from within. Relief flickered across his features at my understanding. Yes, slowly, methodically. When Father stepped back 7 years ago, I began the process of untangling the web he'd created. It hasn't been easy. Many on the board were appointed by him, still loyal to his methods. Marcus aligned himself with them early on. He saw my reforms as weakness, as betraying the Caldwell way of doing business. "That explains the tension Zoe mentioned between you and Marcus," Richard raised an eyebrow. Zoe mentioned that? She and Emma have become fast friends. Children notice more than we think. He nodded ruefully. Emma is perceptive. Too perceptive sometimes. He turned back to the screen, advancing to a new slide showing financial data. This is where we stand now. About 60% of operations have been brought into full compliance with all regulations. The remaining 40% are still problematic. I studied the figures, grateful for my mother's insistence that I understand finance despite my preference for literature. These offshore entities, they're still active? Unfortunately, yes. Dismantling them overnight would trigger too many red flags with regulators. We've been gradually unwinding them, transferring assets back to legitimate operations, but it's delicate work. And meanwhile, the company is still benefiting from these arrangements, I pointed out. Richard didn't deny it. Yes, that's the moral compromise I've been living with. Change too quickly, and the whole company could collapse, taking hundreds of jobs with it. Move too slowly, and we remain complicit in the system Alexandra fought against. It was the same dilemma I'd been wrestling with since reading my mother's journal. How to honor her principles without destroying what could still be salvaged. What's your endgame? I asked. Where do you want the Caldwell group to be in 5 years? For the first time since we'd entered his office, Richard smiled. That's exactly the right question. Not focused on the past, but on the future we want to build. He pulled up another document on the screen. This is what Catherine and I have been working on. A 5-year transformation plan to completely legitimize operations while transitioning our core business toward sustainable industries. I scanned the document with growing interest. The plan was ambitious but thoughtful, divesting from the more problematic sectors like resource extraction, expanding the company's already substantial real estate holdings into affordable housing, developments, and creating a new division focused on renewable energy infrastructure. This doesn't look like the Caldwell group I grew up hearing about, I commented. It's not, Richard agreed. That's the point. Alexandra was right all along. The old model was morally bankrupt. This is the company we should have been building 20 years ago. What's stopping you from implementing it faster? I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Votes on the board. I need a supermajority for structural changes this significant. Marcus has been blocking me, along with 3 of Father's old allies. They see it as too radical a departure from our traditional business model. And now I understood why he'd brought me here today. With my half ownership of the company, I would have significant voting power on the board. You need my support, I stated simply. Richard nodded. Yes, but I don't want you to decide today. Take time to review everything. Consult independent advisors if you wish. This has to be your choice, made with full information. His respect for my autonomy spoke volumes about how much he'd changed from the man who once chose silence over supporting my mother's stand against corruption. I appreciate that, I told him, but I don't need much time to know I support transforming the company into something more ethical. The question is strategy, not direction. Relief visibly washed over him. That's more than I hoped for. Thank you, Olivia. Don't thank me yet, I cautioned. I have conditions. First, complete transparency. I want access to everything, including the records Mom compiled. Second, we need to make restitution where possible for past harms. Environmental cleanup, worker compensation, whatever it takes. And third, I want a public acknowledgement of Mom's role in all this. Her name needs to be cleared completely. Rather than objection, I saw respect in Richard's expression. All reasonable. The third might be challenging from a legal perspective, but we'll find a way. Your mother deserves to be recognized for her courage. We spent the next hour reviewing more detailed aspects of the company's operations and the transformation plan. Richard was forthcoming about both problems and possibilities. treating me as a full partner rather than an outsider to be managed. By the time we prepared to leave for our lunch meeting with Elaine and Catherine, I felt better equipped to handle my unexpected role as company co-owner. As we rode the elevator down to the lobby, Richard asked casually, "Have you thought about what you'll do with the main house? It's legally yours now." The question caught me off guard. With everything else happening, I hadn't given much thought to the sprawling Caldwell mansion. "Not really," I admitted. "It feels too grand for just Zoe and me. The cottage suits us better for now." Richard nodded thoughtfully. "It's a lot of house for one family. Always was, even when we were children." A thought occurred to me, something that had been niggling at the back of my mind since reading my mother's journal. The house has 15 bedrooms, doesn't it? Most of them unused for years. 17, actually. Father insisted on maintaining them all exactly as they were, even after it was just him rattling around in there with Mrs. Holloway. The seed of an idea began to take root. What if we put it to better use? Something that would honor Mom's values while preserving the family legacy in a different way. Richard looked intrigued. "What did you have in mind?" "I'm not sure yet," I said honestly. "But I'll know by the time our family meeting is over." Catherine's home was a surprising departure from traditional Caldwell aesthetics, a modernist structure built into the hillside overlooking the town, with clean lines and expansive windows that invited the natural landscape inside. Solar panels covered the south-facing roof, and a small electric vehicle charging station was installed in the driveway. "Welcome to my rebellion," she greeted us at the door with a warm hug that startled me with its spontaneity. Of the 3 siblings, Catherine had been the youngest and most playful during my childhood, though still 7 years my senior. Now, in her early 40s, she radiated a confident energy that put me instantly at ease. Her dark hair was cut in a practical bob, and she wore a simple linen dress rather than the formal business attire I might have expected from the company's general counsel. "The house is amazing," I told her sincerely. "Thanks," she grinned. "It nearly gave Grandpa Edward an aneurysm when I built it. Said it looked like something from that communist architect he hated." "Frank Lloyd Wright?" I guessed, remembering his disdain for modernism. "The very one. Come in. Elaine's already here. We're having lunch on the terrace." The terrace in question wrapped around the back of the house, offering panoramic views of Oak Ridge below and the mountains beyond. Elaine was setting a simple table under a pergola draped with flowering vines, while a man I didn't recognize was arranging a colorful spread of food. "Olivia, this is my husband, Paolo," Catherine introduced us. "Chief architect of this scandalous house and maker of the best Italian food in 3 counties. Paolo's handshake was warm, his accent melodious as he welcomed me. "Catherine has told me so much about her cousin who stood up to the mighty Edward. It is an honor to finally meet you." His genuine welcome touched me. "The honor is mine. Your home is beautiful." "Just a box of glass and concrete," he replied with a wink. "But what a view to put inside the box, no?" As we settled around the table, I was struck by how comfortable this felt, sharing a meal with family members who had been strangers just days ago, yet somehow finding common ground through shared history and purpose. The conversation flowed naturally as we enjoyed Paolo's homemade focaccia, marinated vegetables, and fresh pasta with pesto made from basil grown in Catherine's garden. "Richard tells me you've seen the transformation plan," Catherine said as we moved on to dessert, a simple but perfect panna cotta with fresh berries. "What do you think?" "I think it's exactly what the Caldwell group needs," I replied honestly. "The question is how we get there, given the opposition on the board." Catherine exchanged glances with Richard and Elaine. "That's why we wanted this meeting. We have a strategy, but it requires all of us working together, and it might create some temporary family discord." "More than we already have?" I asked wryly. "Unfortunately, yes," Elaine confirmed. "Marcus isn't going to take this lying down, and he's rallied the old guard to his side, They're planning to challenge the codicil to Grandpa Edward's will, claiming he wasn't of sound mind when he amended it to include you. The news wasn't entirely surprising, but it still stung. Can they do that? Mr. Harrington seemed confident. Everything was legally sound. It is, Catherine assured me. I've reviewed everything carefully. But they can tie it up in court for months or even years, preventing you from exercising your full ownership rights while the case proceeds. Unless we act preemptively, Richard added, which is what we're proposing to do. Their plan was bold but legally sound. Using the evidence from my mother's journal combined with what Catherine and Richard had compiled over the years, we would approach the 3 non-family board members who had been blocking the transformation plan. Not with threats of exposure, but with transparency, offering them immunity from any legal consequences in exchange for their support in reforming the company completely. Most of them aren't bad people, Catherine explained. They're just products of a business culture that normalized cutting corners. If we offer them a path to redemption rather than destruction, I believe at least 2 will take it. And we only need 2 to achieve the supermajority, Richard concluded. Once that happens, we can implement the transformation plan immediately, before Marcus has time to mount an effective legal challenge to your inheritance. It was a strategy that balanced accountability with pragmatism, holding the company responsible for past wrongs while creating a pathway toward a better future. Exactly the kind of nuanced approach my mother might have endorsed if given the chance. I'm in, I decided. But I want to add something to the plan. I outlined the idea that had been forming since my conversation with Richard earlier. A proposal for the main Caldwell house that would transform it from a symbol of wealth and exclusion into something that served the community while honoring my mother's memory. By the time I finished, Elaine was nodding enthusiastically, Catherine was already making notes on potential legal structures, and Richard's eyes shone with something that looked like pride. Alexandra would have loved this, he said softly. It's exactly what she would have wanted. It won't be easy, Catherine cautioned. Rezoning alone will take months, not to mention the renovations and establishing the foundation to run it. The best things rarely are easy, I replied, feeling more certain of this path with every passing moment. But I think it's worth the effort. To the future of the Caldwell legacy, Elaine proposed, raising her glass. Reimagined for a new generation. We clinked glasses, this small coalition of family members united by a shared vision that transcended the mistakes of the past. For the first time since returning to Oak Ridge, I felt not just like an heir to a problematic fortune, but an architect of something worth building. The next week passed in a whirlwind of activity. Catherine arranged confidential meetings with the board members, presenting our proposal with the perfect balance of legal precision and moral appeal. 2 agreed immediately to support the transformation plan. The 3rd requested time to consider his position, but seemed inclined to join us rather than remain aligned with the old guard. Meanwhile, Zoe had fully integrated into summer life at the estate, spending days exploring with Emma, learning to sail on the lake with Catherine's husband Paolo, and even tentatively connecting with Marcus's younger daughters during a family dinner that Richard insisted upon hosting to maintain appearances, while our plan proceeded behind the scenes. I divided my time between studying the company operations, consulting with architects about the feasibility of my plans for the main house, and getting to know this branch of my family that had been denied to me for 15 years. It wasn't all smooth sailing. Marcus remained coldly formal whenever our paths crossed, clearly suspicious of my sudden acceptance by his sisters and father. Patricia maintained a careful distance, caught between loyalty to her husband Richard and her son, Marcus. And occasionally I would find myself overwhelmed by the sheer scale of what we were attempting to transform. Not just a business empire, but generations of family culture. In those moments, I would retreat to the cottage by the lake, find Zoe, practicing her violin or reading on the deck, And remember what really mattered. Not the Caldwell fortune or name, but the chance to build a life of purpose and integrity, the very things my mother had sacrificed everything to preserve. 10. Days after our lunch at Catherine's house, we were ready to move forward. The board was scheduled to meet the following morning to vote on the transformation plan, with our coalition now holding the necessary majority. Richard had prepared a statement acknowledging the company's past ethical failings and committing to a new direction. Catherine had drafted comprehensive legal documents to implement the changes while protecting the company from undue exposure. Everything was in place for a pivotal moment in the Caldwell Group's history. Which is why I shouldn't have been surprised when Marcus appeared at the cottage door that evening, his expression a complex mixture of anger and something that looked almost like fear. "We need to talk," he announced without preamble. Alone. Zoe was at the main house for a movie night with Emma and her cousins, so we had the cottage to ourselves. I invited him in with more calmness than I felt, offering coffee, which he declined with a curt shake of his head. "I know what you're planning," he said, pacing the small living room like a caged animal. "The board vote tomorrow, the transformation. Plan, all of it." "It's not a secret, Marcus," I replied evenly. "The agenda was distributed to all board members last week." "Don't play games with me," he snapped. "This isn't about official agendas. This is about you coming back after 15 years and trying to dismantle everything our family has built." His characterization was so fundamentally wrong that I had to take a breath before responding. "That's not what's happening. We're trying to save the company by making it sustainable and ethical. The old model is a liability, not an asset. Easy for you to say. You haven't dedicated your life to this business. You haven't worked alongside these people for 20 years. You haven't had to face the consequences of operating outside the law?" I finished for him. "You're right. I haven't. But that doesn't make it right, Marcus." He stopped pacing, fixing me with an intense stare. "Do you have any idea what will happen if this plan goes through? The jobs that could be lost during the transition? The value that could be wiped out overnight?" "Yes, actually I do," I countered. "I've spent the past week reviewing every detail with financial analysts, legal experts, and your father, who built this company alongside Grandpa Edward and cares about it every bit as much as you do." That seemed to catch him off guard. "Dad doesn't understand. He's been soft since Mother died. Sentimental. Or perhaps he's been wise," I suggested, recognizing that change is inevitable, and it's better to control it than be destroyed by it. Marcus moved to the window overlooking the lake, his back to me. For a long moment he was silent, shoulders tense beneath his expensive suit jacket. When he finally spoke again, his voice had lost some of its edge. "I'm not blind to the problems," he admitted reluctantly. "I know, some of Father's methods were questionable. But there are other ways to address that without this radical overhaul." I joined him at the window, maintaining a respectful distance but wanting to engage rather than oppose. Such as gradual reforms, targeted compliance, improvements. We've already made progress in several divisions. "Too slow," I said, not unkindly. "The evidence in my mother's journal is damning, Marcus. If it ever became public, the company wouldn't survive the scandal. This isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about saving what can be saved." He turned to face me, his expression conflicted. "Your mother. It always comes back to her, doesn't it? The saint who tried to save us from ourselves." There was bitterness in his words, but also a hint of something else, perhaps reluctant respect. "She wasn't a saint," I corrected gently. "Just someone who believed that principles matter more than profit. That integrity isn't negotiable. Values I think you understand, even if you've been taught to suppress them." Something flickered in his eyes, a moment of recognition, quickly shuttered. "You don't know me." "No," I agreed. But I'm getting to know your daughters. They speak highly of you, not as a businessman, but as a father. They say you've always taught them to be honest, to keep their promises, to stand up for what they believe in. It was a calculated observation, but a truthful one. Despite our differences, Marcus had raised children with strong moral compasses, something that suggested his own values might run deeper than his business practices indicated. "They're good girls," he said softly, the first genuine warmth I'd heard in his voice. "They are," I confirmed. "They reflect well on you and Diane." He seemed to struggle internally for a moment, then asked abruptly, "This plan, what happens to my division under it?" "Green technology investment increases by 40% over 3 years," I replied promptly, having anticipated this question. "Your team leads the transition from traditional energy holdings to renewables. It's a promotion, not a demotion, Marcus. We need your expertise and relationships to make this work." Another long silence as he processed this information. "And if I oppose it? If I continue fighting the codicil, challenging your place on the board?" I met his gaze directly. "Then we proceed anyway, but with unnecessary conflict that hurts the family and potentially the company. Is that really the legacy you want to create?" The question hung between us, laden with implications about family, values, and the kind of example he wanted to set for his children. Marcus might be stubborn and entitled, but he wasn't stupid. He could see the writing on the wall. "I need to think," he said finally. "I can't promise anything for tomorrow's vote." It wasn't a surrender, but it was more than I'd hoped for when he first appeared at my door. "That's fair. Take the time you need." As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Your daughter, Zoe. She's been good for Emma. Brought her out of her shell somehow." The observation, offered awkwardly but sincerely, felt like the first genuine connection between us. They've become fast friends. Emma's helped Zoe feel connected to a family history she never knew existed. Marcus nodded, seeming to wrestle with something. "Family is complicated." "The most worthwhile things usually are," I replied, echoing what I'd told Zoe days earlier. After he left, I stood on the cottage steps watching the moonlight ripple across the lake's surface, feeling oddly hopeful despite the uncertain outcome of our conversation. Whether Marcus joined us tomorrow or continued his opposition, we had the votes to move forward. But something told me his resistance was weakening, not because of threats or leverage, but because somewhere beneath the entitled Caldwell air was a father who wanted to build something his daughters could be proud of. And perhaps that was the most powerful legacy my mother had left behind. Not just the evidence that might transform a company, but the reminder that even in the most pragmatic business decisions, what ultimately matters most is the example we set for the next generation. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but tonight, under a canopy of stars reflected in still waters, I felt ready to face whatever came next, not alone as my mother had been, but surrounded by allies who shared a vision of what the Caldwell name could represent if liberated from the shadows of its past. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.